everybody, I'm Alexis, and in this video I wanted to talk about if you're new to Myers Briggs, what would you do? So this video is going to be kind of a one-stop shop for the best information that I found over my 5 years of learning about Myers Briggs and cognitive functions and how to kind of speed up the process and what I've learned along the way. So the first thing I would do is I would take one of the personality tests, and it would be, if I were to pick one, it would be the personality hacker test because it's based on cognitive functions. Now this needs to be taken with a grain of salt because they're only about 50% accurate, so that's very inaccurate. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't make it, it's not the be-all end-all result. It gives you a starting point. It gives you somewhere to work off of. So it'll at least give you a starting point, even if it's not perfect, and even in some cases if it's very off, it'll give you a starting point. So what I would then do is I would read a description of that personality type and see if it's resonating or if it's not. If it's really not resonating, stop reading it. Move on to something else that's not resonating. This is kind of the second step. Read through the description of the personality type that it gave you and then read through slight differences. So for me, let's say I got the result INTJ. I should read through the ENTJ, read through the ISTJ, the INFJ, and the INTP. So just change maybe the slight letter differences and read through all those, so anything that would be close, and then read through all those descriptions and see if that resonates more. So then once you've read through those, see which one resonates the most. And I want to make sure that you're doing this in an accountable way, so make sure you're doing this with your spouse, significant other, best friend, someone who knows you really well, because I think sometimes some of the personality descriptions are written in better ways than others. Like I would say the description for the INFJ sounds really great, whereas if you read a description for an ISTJ, it just sounds like a boring pile of crap, basically. In the pursuit of stroking your ego, you might pursue the one that has the best description, when in reality, that's just the fault of the writer for writing a biased description. So once you've landed on a personality type that you feel like is really, it's well-fitting and you feel like describes you well, go ahead and Google your cognitive function stack. So I would just Google, for me, I would Google INTJ cognitive function stack, and then I would go ahead and write down I would write down that stack. So for me, it'd be NITEFISE. So it'll just be 4 abbreviations like that. Go ahead and write it down. We'll explain what that means in a second. I do have a video, which I will link above, which basically talks about what the pattern is to know what the cognitive function stack is for any of the 16 personality types. So the next thing I would do, the fourth step, would be to research the descriptions of the cognitive functions. So I would take my stack like NI and research what that means. TE, what does that mean? And I have a pretty good intro video which talks about it. I'll link that one above also. It's a good intro for the cognitive functions and their axes, which you'll see in that video what that means. So just go ahead and read descriptions of them so you get a good handle on what those 4 functions are. At this point, you may read the description of the functions and feel like, oh, actually that's not me. And so you may have to go back to the previous step where you were trying to figure out what your cognitive functions actually are. So at each step of the way, it's kind of like a checks and balance system, and each step of the way you're trying to figure out, does this feel right? If it doesn't feel right, you go back to the drawing board. Because once it feels right, it does. It really feels right. So once you've read some descriptions of your personality type and how your specific cognitive functions affect you in their specific slot, and you've read some descriptions of your personality type, I would take a note of blind spots. And I would do this with a significant other, once again, or a best friend. And take note of the positive and the negative blind spots. I think we're kind of acutely aware that we might have negative blind spots, like, oh, there are bad things that I do that I don't realize I'm doing. But there are really great things that you're doing that you don't realize other people aren't doing. That is one thing that can be really beneficial about things like Myers Briggs when it comes to blind spots. And I think a lot of people feel like it's a box that you get put in. And I think a lot of times that comes from people reading the incorrect description of themselves. They read this incorrect description and it feels like a box because it doesn't feel authentic to them. But once you do get an authentic description, it can actually give you more permission to step into an area of strength that you didn't realize you had, but a significant other can verify, yeah, you've always had that strength, let's develop it. And now that it's on your radar and it's been communicated and you have the vocabulary to communicate it, you can now pursue greater freedom. So the next thing I would do is I would develop the cognitive functions that are the opposite attitude to your dominant function. So basically what that means is if you're an introvert, develop your extroverted cognitive functions. And if you're an extrovert, develop your introverted cognitive functions. There are a few different streams of thought for why this is. Essentially, when I first got started, I was listening to the Personality Hacker podcast the most, and kind of their soundbite, as they call it, is to develop your auxiliary function. That's your second function. And so that will be the opposite attitude of your dominant function. So that's one area where people say to develop. They say, okay, go ahead and develop that second function. Another area where I've heard people say to develop your subconscious, and that does lead with your inferior function. So basically, the kind of short way to sum that up is just to develop your 2 functions that are the opposite attitude of your dominant function. What makes the most well-rounded person is someone who creates powerful things. So when you spend all that time consuming first and getting really valid, deep information, and then you create something off that, it's way more powerful than if you had skipped over the reflective process. And at the same time, if you never created anything, you're not really of value to anyone besides your very close relationships if you don't take that deep information that you have and give it to other people. So just kind of a side note, develop your opposite attitude function so that you're a more well-rounded person that can kind of get out of your comfort zone. I would do kind of the next step. So you've read descriptions about your type. I would then take a step further and maybe read books about your type. I would listen to podcasts, watch YouTube videos about your type. And then I would also extend that to the type with the opposite dominant attitude and also your subconscious type. So as an example, I'm an INTJ, so I listen to lots of INTJ podcasts. I also listen to ENTJ podcasts because I'm trying to develop my extrovert function. I'm trying to be more like an ENTJ is what I would like to be. And I also listen to ESFP podcasts, and I kind of take notes from their strengths. So I don't like exactly listen to the ENTJ and ESFP like I listen to the INTJ podcast, but I listen to them in a way that says, hey, these are their strengths. That seems accessible. That seems accessible. So I take the things that seem within low enough reach that I could work on, and I work on those things. Yeah, so that's basically my process. That's kind of what I've learned over the last 5 years. So that's kind of what I wish I would have known. That's kind of the soundbite process. So you basically take the test, figure out your type, verify your type over a course of several steps, learn about the cognitive functions, and then develop the ones with the opposite attitude. So that's, there you go, there you have it. So let me know how you guys have used Myers Briggs and cognitive functions for growth and how you've used it to get outside of boxes. I would love to hear about